Good evening. Tonight we're stepping into the shadowed corners of human psychology, where the gentlest souls discover their most formidable strength. You probably wouldn't survive this. That's not a scare tactic. It's a fact check, because what I'm about to describe has broken countless people until the moment it forged them into something unrecognizable. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are in the world and what time it is right now as you listen. Now, turn off the lights, maybe switch on a fan for some soft background noise, and let's begin tonight's journey together. I've always believed that the breaking point comes silently, almost invisibly. For empathic people like me, it doesn't happen in a blaze of shouting matches or slammed doors. It happens in the quiet hours, when you realize that the weight you've been carrying has been building for years, not days. I used to think my kindness was a fragile thing, something people could snap in half with a single careless word. But the truth was far darker and far more fascinating. Every slight, every betrayal, every dismissal I endured wasn't erased. It was being recorded somewhere deep inside me, like my subconscious was keeping an audit of human behavior. The spark of awakening, as Jung once observed, isn't gradual. It is sudden, almost violent in its clarity. I remember the exact moment mine happened, a betrayal so sharp that it sliced through my illusions and left me standing in a reality I'd been avoiding for far too long. It wasn't just pain, it was data, reassembled into meaning. One minute I was drowning in self-doubt. The next I was seeing every hidden thread that had been woven around me. Imagine trying to fix a puzzle in the dark for years. Then suddenly someone switches on the light. It isn't rage that floods you, it's recognition. I often joke that empaths would make excellent detectives, except our magnifying glass is emotional rather than physical. But here's the cruel irony. For most of our lives, people dismiss us as oversensitive. They laugh at our observations, brush off our concerns, and say things like, "You're imagining it." I sometimes wonder how history might have unfolded if more people had listened to the quiet warnings of the so-called fragile ones. Because we're not fragile, we're observers in disguise. And when the disguise falls, the world tends to tremble. The funny thing about my awakening was how calm it felt. I'd expected a breakdown, screaming, crying, the full drama of a soap opera. Instead, there was this unnerving stillness, like the air before a thunderstorm. I realized, with unsettling clarity, that I wasn't falling apart. I was finally putting myself back together. That's when I understood that the empath's greatest tragedy is not the depth of their feeling, but the length of time they spend doubting what those feelings reveal. Wisdom is strange. It often sneaks up on you disguised as exhaustion. My grandmother once told me, "When you are tired of crying, you will start seeing." At the time, I thought it was just one of those poetic things old people say when they want to sound profound. Years later, I saw the truth of it. Awakening doesn't come from wanting justice or revenge. It comes when you're too exhausted to carry the illusions any longer. That exhaustion, paradoxically, is the first breath of freedom. Here's a quirky fact for you. Octopuses have more neurons in their arms than in their brains. Each arm can think for itself, independently. Sometimes, I feel empaths operate the same way. Our emotions branch out into so many directions, gathering sensory data and responding instinctively, long before our conscious minds have caught up. People think we're intuitive, but really we're decentralized processors of human behavior. That's why when the awakening happens, it feels like all those independent arms of perception suddenly connect into one powerful center. Academics have long debated whether empathy is an evolutionary advantage or a liability. One camp argues that empaths are necessary for social cohesion, the glue that holds communities together. Another suggests that empaths are evolutionary leftovers, relics of a time when survival depended on heightened sensitivity to group dynamics. Personally, I think both arguments miss the point. Empathy is neither a gift nor a curse. It's raw material. What you build with it depends entirely on whether you remain unconscious of its power or step fully into it. That's the terrifying part. Once you wake up, you can't go back. The spark doesn't extinguish itself. The illusions don't glue themselves together again. You see everything as it is, not as you wish it to be. And you realize with sudden, cold clarity that you've been walking through life half asleep, mislabeled as weak. when in fact you were absorbing the entire blueprint of human nature. I like to think of that moment as a psychological Big Bang. Before it, everything was scattered, chaotic, disconnected. After it, everything expanded rapidly into form and pattern. The first part of my transformation wasn't about becoming stronger or braver. It was about seeing what had always been there, waiting for me to acknowledge it. And that seeing, that unbearable clarity, is the spark that awakens an empath into something entirely new. When the clarity arrives, the first thing you notice is not rage or even grief. It's the sheer volume of data you've been carrying without realizing it. Imagine a filing cabinet in your mind that has been stuffed for decades. Every drawer jammed with records of people's words, micro-expressions, sighs, and half-truths for most of my life. I didn't even know I was archiving these details. I just thought I was being attentive, or worse, paranoid. But when the spark ignited, all those dusty drawers flew open at once, and the patterns arranged themselves into something undeniable. Suddenly, I wasn't just a passive listener to my own story. I was the archivist and the interpreter all at once. Jung was right to call it shadow integration. He believed that the shadow isn't the evil in us, but the disowned parts, the intelligence, the clarity, the capacity for truth we've been told to suppress. When I first read his notes, I remember whispering, "That's me," because what I discovered was that my greatest weakness, absorbing pain, noticing too much, feeling everything, was actually the foundation of an incredibly precise instrument. I wasn't broken. I'd been building quietly, invisibly. I'd been constructing a kind of inner war room, stocked with maps of human behavior. There's a peculiar kind of satisfaction in realizing you've been underestimated for so long. I almost wanted to thank the people who dismissed me. They had no idea that every time they waved away my instincts, I filed their denial into another drawer. It was like being the quiet student in the back of the classroom who nobody notices until exam day, when suddenly you reveal you've been studying everyone's mistakes all along. My awakening didn't feel like learning something new. It felt like remembering what I'd always known. I remember sitting across from someone who had hurt me deeply, someone I'd once trusted completely. As they spoke, every lie seemed to glow in neon. I could see the way their jaw tightened half a second before they fabricated a story. I noticed the flicker of their eyes to the left, the pause that lingered a fraction too long. Before, I would have gaslit myself. "You're being too sensitive. Stop imagining things." But this time, no. My inner files snapped into order, presenting the evidence like a lawyer in court. The verdict was clear, and for the first time, I trusted my own courtroom. What people rarely understand is that empaths don't want to expose anyone. We don't sit around plotting revenge or crafting elaborate traps. In fact, we crave peace so much that we're willing to sacrifice ourselves for it. That's why the transformation is so unsettling. It's not a choice. It's a culmination, a moment when all the compassion, silence, and endurance ferment into truth. And truth, when finally spoken, has a power that terrifies those who once relied on your compliance. An old proverb says, "The axe forgets, but the tree remembers." I used to laugh at that, imagining trees gossiping about lumberjacks. But now, I feel the weight of its wisdom. For years, I thought I had forgiven people because I didn't lash out. I mistook silence for forgiveness. But silence is just storage. The tree still carries the mark of the blade. Awakening is when you stop pretending those scars aren't there, and instead start reading them as a record of survival. Here's a quirky fact. Ravens, those mysterious black birds people associate with omens, are capable of remembering human faces for years. If you've ever annoyed a raven, it will warn its friends about you, and they'll all treat you like a villain in their feathery soap opera. When I learned this, I laughed because that's exactly what awakening feels like. We are the ravens of human psychology, silent observers until we decide it's time to remember. And once we remember, we never forget. Academically, there's a concept known as emotional labor, often used to describe the invisible work people, usually women, do to maintain relationships and social harmony. But what no one tells you is that empaths carry a double portion of this burden. We don't just manage our emotions, we manage everyone else's, too. When awakening happens, it's the collapse of that invisible economy. The moment when you stop subsidizing dysfunction with your silence. And like any economy collapse, the ones who are profiting most from your free labor panic the hardest. The strangest part of my awakening was how ordinary the moment itself felt. I wasn't standing on a mountaintop or meditating under a full moon. I was washing dishes. My mind replayed an argument I'd had years earlier, and suddenly all the lies stacked neatly into a tower. And like any unstable tower, it collapsed in a single instant of recognition. I stood there with soapy hands, whispering. I knew it. That was it. The awakening doesn't arrive with trumpets. It arrives like a light bulb in a quiet room, so blinding precisely because of how long you've been sitting in the dark. What followed was not fury, but precision. I started recalling details with startling accuracy, conversations from years ago, expressions I'd brushed aside, inconsistencies I had smoothed over to protect relationships. They all lined up. Undeniable. It wasn't about punishment anymore. It was about clarity. And clarity is terrifying because it leaves no room for illusion. The very people who had once mocked me for being too emotional suddenly seemed like children, fumbling in the dark, while I stood holding the torch. Looking back now, I see the irony. For years, I thought I was too soft for this world. In reality, I was simply sharpening in silence. My shadow wasn't waiting to devour me, it was waiting to join me. And when it did, when I finally allowed it to stand beside me, I realized I wasn't a fragile empath at all. I was something much more unsettling. I was awake. The first days after awakening were eerily calm. I had always imagined transformation as a thunderstorm, loud, chaotic, with lightning bolts tearing across the sky. Instead, it felt like waking up in a quiet room where every object was finally in its rightful place. Nothing was missing. Nothing was out of order. The noise that had hummed at the edge of my awareness for years had suddenly switched off. And for the first time in my life, I heard silence not as emptiness, but as presence. Jung would have called this the stage of integration, where the denied aspects of the self return home. But for me, it felt like moving into a house I had owned all along but never dared to enter. Every room was familiar, yet filled with light I had never switched on. There were corners of anger that no longer frightened me, shelves of strength I had never used, entire hallways of clarity that now stretched endlessly. I wasn't overwhelmed. I was grounded. What unsettled others most was my new stillness. People who had once expected me to bend, to apologize, to shrink at their disapproval, suddenly found me immovable. I didn't shout. I didn't retaliate. I simply stopped yielding. It was like the ground beneath me had hardened, and no one could push me off it anymore. When they raised their voices, I let the words pass like gusts of wind. When they tried to guilt-trip me, I watched the performance with the detachment of someone reading subtitles on a bad film. The drama was still happening, but I no longer felt cast in the role they had written for me. The human nervous system is extraordinary. Did you know the average brain processes about 11 million pieces of information per second, but we're only consciously aware of around 40? Awakening felt like the ratio had shifted suddenly. I wasn't filtering so much away. I could see the micro movements, hear the hesitations, sense the contradictions in every sentence. It was like upgrading from a grainy VHS tape to high-definition reality. And once you see in high definition, you can't go back. I remember attending a family gathering not long after my clarity event. These were people who had always relied on me to play peacemaker, the one who smoothed over awkward silences and cushioned every blow of tension. This time, I just watched, and oh, what a show it was. The uncle who always boasted about his generosity couldn't hide the bitterness that curled around his smile. The cousin who played the victim in every story revealed, through one poorly timed eye roll, the calculation behind her self-pity. It wasn't cruel to notice. It was simply obvious. And for the first time, I realized that my silence had always been mistaken for ignorance. Old age wisdom has a way of sneaking up on you. My grandmother once told me, still waters cut deeper than rushing rivers. I laughed at the time, imagining her trying to be poetic over a cup of tea. But now, I understand. Stillness isn't weakness. It's depth. And when you finally inhabit your depth, people who prefer the shallows can't follow you there. They flail. They splash. They panic, but they can't anchor you anymore. Here's a quirky side note. Octopuses, yes, those squishy, alien-looking sea creatures have been known to escape aquariums by memorizing guard routines, identifying weak points in enclosures, and then slipping out at night to raid nearby fish tanks. They return before anyone notices, leaving scientists baffled until cameras reveal the escape. That's exactly how my empath brain felt after awakening. I realized I had been mapping escape routes for years, memorizing people's weaknesses, anticipating their moves. Only now, I no longer used it for survival. I used it for freedom. In academic terms, psychologists call this cognitive reappraisal, the ability to reinterpret experiences in a way that reduces distress. But what happens when reappraisal evolves into recognition? You stop reinterpreting toxic behavior as your fault. You stop excusing dysfunction as just how they are. You begin to label things correctly. Manipulation becomes manipulation. Betrayal becomes betrayal. Lies become lies. It's astonishing how liberating accurate labeling can be. I think the most disorienting part for others was that I didn't try to convince them of anything. Once, I would have written long messages, explaining my perspective, pleading to be understood. After awakening, I simply observed. If they lied, I noted it. If they twisted my words, I let the twist dangle, obvious in its desperation. I didn't need validation anymore because I had finally validated myself, and that was the shift that terrified them most. Their approval was no longer currency I depended on. Of course, there were moments when I tested this new stillness. Once, in a conversation, someone accused me of being too cold. I smiled, tilted my head, and asked, "Or is it that I'm no longer easy to control?" The silence that followed was priceless. I didn't mean it cruelly. It was simply the truth. Delivered plainly, and truth, when spoken without apology, lands heavier than any insult. Looking back, I realize how much of my life had been lived in reaction. I absorbed, adjusted, adapted. Awakening flipped the equation. Suddenly, others were reacting to me. They felt the shift even before I spoke it. The predator's instinct Jung described was real. Manipulative people sense when their tricks stop working. Like wolves circling prey, only to discover the prey has teeth. They retreat, confused, uneasy, and the beautiful part? You don't need to chase them away. Your clarity does the work for you. The days that followed were filled with small rebellions that felt monumental. I stopped replying to texts designed to bait me into arguments. I declined invitations that had always drained me. I allowed silence to be my boundary. And with every choice, I felt my spine straighten, as though I were growing taller inside myself. For once, I wasn't shaping myself to fit the world. I was letting the world reshape itself around me. Awakening isn't fireworks. It's architecture, brick by brick, choice by choice. You construct a life that finally reflects the truth you've always carried. And as the walls rose around me, I didn't feel trapped. I felt sheltered, stronger than I had ever imagined. Not because I built armor, but because I built honesty. And honesty, I discovered, is the most unbreakable foundation of all. There was a peculiar tension in the air once I started living differently. It wasn't dramatic, not like the kind of tension you see in films where people slam doors or throw wine glasses across the room. No, this was quieter, subtler, and in many ways far more unnerving. People who had once relied on me to fold, to soften, to smooth things over suddenly found themselves confronted with someone who neither argued nor complied. I simply held my ground. And that, it seemed, was more unsettling than any confrontation could ever have been. I noticed the shift most clearly in conversations. Before, I had been a master of nodding, smiling, and agreeing even when every fiber of me screamed against it. I had built a lifetime of smoothing over others' discomfort with my silence. But now, when someone lied, I let the silence hang there like an uninvited guest. When someone attempted to guilt me, I didn't rush to soothe them. I simply sat, calm and steady, allowing the weight of their own words to fall where they belonged. It was extraordinary how quickly people revealed themselves when I stopped cushioning their impact. Jung described this stage as the moment when shadow integration becomes visible to others. To me, it felt like becoming a mirror. People saw themselves reflected more honestly in my presence, and they didn't always like what they saw. Those who had lived comfortably in the shadows of half-truths and manipulations squirmed beneath the clarity. Some became defensive, others aggressive, and a few quietly withdrew. It was like switching on a light in a dark room. Suddenly everyone's posture, motives, and intentions were glaringly obvious. The oddest part was how ordinary I felt. I didn't feel like a warrior or some mythical awakened empath. I felt like myself, only whole. I wasn't performing anymore. I wasn't curating my reactions to make others more comfortable. And that ordinariness was exactly what made it so extraordinary. It wasn't about being stronger than others. It was about no longer being weaker than myself. One evening, a friend tried the usual tactic of "you're imagining things." For years, that phrase had been enough to shut me down, to make me doubt every perception, every instinct. But this time, something inside me refused to bend. I smiled faintly and said, maybe I've finally stopped imagining you're better than you are." The words weren't sharp. They were simply factual, and the silence that followed spoke volumes. Old age wisdom often hides in plain sight. My grandfather once muttered during a family quarrel, "Some truths need no shouting." At the time, I thought he was avoiding conflict. Now I see he was speaking a deeper wisdom. Truth, when you finally trust it, doesn't need volume. It resonates on its own frequency, and once you've tuned into that frequency, you can't be deafened by anyone else's noise. Here's a quirky fact that came to me during those days. Ravens are among the most intelligent birds, and they've been observed to deliberately withhold information. For instance, when they hide food, they'll sometimes pretend to stash it in one place while secretly hiding it elsewhere, especially if another raven is watching. In other words, they understand deception, and yet, once you've learned to spot their tells, the tiny hesitation, the sideways glance, you can always tell where the real food is. People, it turns out, are not so different. They perform their little deceptions, but once you've awakened, the tells are impossible to miss. Academically, what I was experiencing could be described as epistemic confidence, the assurance in the reliability of one's own knowledge. For years, I had been gaslighted into believing my knowledge of human behavior was flawed, that my instincts were unreliable, but now, the integration of my shadow meant that I trusted what I observed. I didn't need consensus to validate it. And that, perhaps, is the most radical act an empath can perform. To trust their own perception more than the opinions of others. I won't pretend it was always comfortable. There were moments when I wondered if I had gone too far, when the new stillness felt cold even to me. Once, I watched an old friend unravel in front of me, using the same manipulative tactics she had always relied on, half apologies and twisted stories, a performance of fragility. Before, I would have rushed in, trying to rescue her from her own web. This time, I simply listened, and then I said, "I can't help you if you won't tell yourself the truth." Her face crumpled, and for a moment I felt cruel. But then I realized cruelty would have been to enable her delusion once more. Sometimes, kindness wears the mask of firmness, and it takes age and clarity to see the difference. There were also strange, almost humorous moments. Once, someone accused me of being too intense because I no longer laughed at their shallow jokes. I almost did laugh then, not at the joke, but at the irony. I wanted to say, if you think noticing reality is intense, you should try living blindfolded. But I didn't. I just smiled and sipped my tea. Sometimes the best joke is the one you keep to yourself. What fascinated me most was how people adjusted around me. Some, who had once dominated every conversation, suddenly became tentative, choosing their words more carefully. Others, who had genuinely good hearts, leaned closer, as if sensing a space where they could finally be honest, without fear of being judged or dismissed. My presence seemed to act as a filter. The manipulative withdrew. The authentic stepped forward. It wasn't something I orchestrated. It happened naturally, as though the universe had recalibrated the social field around me. And slowly, I began to realize that this was only the beginning. The calm wasn't an ending, but a foundation. The stillness wasn't emptiness, but preparation. I wasn't simply learning to hold my ground. I was beginning to see the new terrain that stretched beyond it. The journey wasn't just about rejecting manipulation. It was about building something truer in its place. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of what would come next. The clarity event did more than just alter my relationships. It altered the way I experienced time itself. Before, my days had been swallowed by the constant hum of anxiety, that restless background noise of wondering how others felt, what they thought of me, whether I had said too much or too little. It was exhausting, like living in a room where the lights flickered endlessly. After the awakening, the flicker stopped. The light became steady, and in that steadiness, I noticed hours stretching differently. Conversations that once drained me now ended quickly. Interactions that once felt like battles became straightforward, sometimes even amusing. One afternoon, I met someone who had been one of my most consistent challengers, a person who thrived on pushing others into corners. They began, as usual, with sly comments designed to test my boundaries. I didn't counter with wit or anger. I just said, evenly, "You'll need a different script with me now." They froze, mid-smile, as though someone had swapped the stage beneath their feet. That was the thing about this new calm. It wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. Like the silence after a thunderclap, it carried more weight than any words I could have spoken. Jung once described betrayal as the alchemical fire that transforms the psyche. In my own experience, betrayal had burned away the illusions I had clung to about people's intentions. It was as though I had been peering through frosted glass all my life. And suddenly, the frost had melted. I could see clearly, perhaps too clearly. I knew when people were hedging their words, when their smiles didn't match their eyes, when their kindness was laced with obligation, and instead of bending myself to fit their narratives, I simply allowed the truth to stand naked between us. Wisdom from the elders always comes back at unexpected moments. I remember my grandmother telling me, when I was very young, that trust is like fine china, beautiful, but once cracked, it will always show the fracture. I used to think she meant that broken trust could never be restored. Now I see she meant something subtler. The crack doesn't destroy the plate, but it changes it forever. And sometimes, the plate is stronger for it, because you handle it more carefully, more consciously. That's how trust felt to me now, not absent, but precise. I didn't trust blindly anymore. I trusted deliberately. I also became fascinated by small, almost silly details. Did you know octopuses have 3 hearts? And 2 of them stop beating when they swim. I discovered that fact in the middle of one of my long walks, and it struck me as oddly symbolic. So much of my life before had been like those 2 hearts, stopping every time I moved, beating only when I stood still, paralyzed by fear. But now, I felt like the 3rd heart, the one that kept going regardless, pulsing steadily in all circumstances. That tiny piece of trivia somehow anchored me. If an octopus could adapt to such a strange rhythm, surely I could too. From an academic perspective, what I was experiencing was what psychologists might call cognitive restructuring, a reorganization of thought patterns in response to trauma or insight. But what the textbooks never quite capture is the lived texture of it. It isn't just thoughts that change, it's your entire nervous system. The tension in your shoulders, the knots in your stomach, the way your breath comes more evenly. It's as though the body has been waiting all along for the mind to catch up. Once it does, everything aligns. Yet, even with this newfound clarity, there were moments of humor. I once caught myself apologizing to a chair after bumping into it. Old habits die hard. I laughed out loud in my kitchen, shaking my head. Really, I said to no one in particular. I can face down manipulation and betrayal, but I can't stop saying sorry to furniture. That's the paradox of growth. You can transform in the most profound ways and still trip over your own silliness. And perhaps that's exactly what keeps us human. Another time, I noticed how people's reactions change not only in words, but in their physical presence. One colleague, who used to tower over me with his booming voice, suddenly kept his distance, as though I had developed an invisible force field. Meanwhile, someone quieter, someone genuine, seemed to relax more in my presence, opening up in ways they never had before. It wasn't magic. It was the natural shift that happens when you stop leaking energy. People sense it. They feel the difference between someone who can be drained and someone who cannot. I also became more attuned to the absurdity of social rituals. At a dinner party, someone began a long-winded tale clearly designed to impress. Before, I would have smiled and nodded, feeding their performance. This time, I simply let the silence expand after their punchline. No laughter, no polite reinforcement. They shifted uncomfortably and muttered, "Well, maybe you had to be there." It was oddly liberating, refusing to play my old part in other people's scripts. I wasn't cruel. I was just absent from their theater, and that absence was louder than applause. Looking back, what strikes me most is how natural the transition felt once it began. People imagine transformation as fireworks, but mine was more like dawn. Slow, inevitable, and unstoppable. At first, the light felt fragile, as though someone could snuff it out with a careless word. But the longer I stood in it, the more I realized it wasn't a candle. It was the sun, and no one could put it out. When I think about the moment of integration, the word that comes to mind is inevitability. It wasn't like I suddenly acquired a new skill or stumbled upon a hidden treasure. It felt more like I had been carrying a locked chest my entire life, and betrayal was simply the key that finally turned. Once it clicked open, everything that spilled out was both familiar and foreign: my own intelligence, my own strength, my own clarity. Things I had hidden so long I forgot they were mine. Integration wasn't peaceful at first. It was disorienting, like learning to walk again with muscles you didn't know you had. I remember sitting in my car one afternoon, gripping the steering wheel, and realizing I didn't feel guilty anymore. That might sound trivial, but for someone who apologized for existing, the absence of guilt felt like floating in space without gravity. I wasn't weighed down. I wasn't shrinking myself for someone else's comfort. I was simply there, occupying my own skin. One of the strangest parts was how my emotions changed texture. Anger, which I had always feared, stopped being explosive. It became a compass. Instead of swallowing it down, I treated it like a road sign. Here is a boundary you need to defend. Sadness, too, lost its heaviness. It became an echo, a reminder that I had loved deeply enough to be hurt. I once joked to a friend that my emotions were like Pokemon. I had been trying to keep them in their little balls, but integration meant letting them out to evolve. She laughed and said, "Just don't let your anger evolve into Charizard indoors." 3 witty jokes per 1,000 words. Right, that one was worth it. There's an old saying, still waters run deep. I used to think it was just about quiet people hiding depth. But integration made me realize it's also about calmness that contains power. My calm was no longer submission. It was depth. When someone shouted at me, I didn't crumble. I didn't even need to shout back. I just looked at them with a stillness that said, "I see you, and I'm not moved." That unnerved them far more than any counterattack. Did you know that crows can remember human faces for years, even decades, and pass those memories down to their offspring? I read that and thought, so basically, crows are holding generational grudges. It resonated with me because integration felt a little like that, remembering everything clearly, but no longer carrying it as a wound. The memories didn't vanish. They became reference points, lessons cataloged rather than scars to hide. Like the crows, I remembered, but instead of grudge, I carried wisdom. Academically, Jung would have called this process shadow integration, the merging of disowned aspects of the self into conscious awareness. But for me, it wasn't clinical. It was like finally switching from standard definition to high definition. Everything sharper, everyone's motives clearer, and my own patterns undeniable. I could no longer pretend I didn't see what I saw. And that responsibility was both liberating and heavy. It changed how I spoke. I stopped cushioning my truths with endless disclaimers. I didn't lace every sentence with apologies. I became concise, direct, and, oddly enough, softer at the same time. Because when you know your words are precise, you don't need to shout. I could say to someone, "I don't think that's true," in a tone so calm it sliced through their performance. They would sputter, expecting the old me, the apologetic, deferential me, but she was gone. This also brought unexpected humor into my life. Once, someone tried to manipulate me with crocodile tears. I watched them, head tilted, and said, "You're good at that. Do you practice in the mirror?" The look on their face was priceless, like a magician whose trick had just been spoiled. I wasn't mocking them, just acknowledging the performance. And strangely, instead of escalating, it ended the game. The moment someone realizes you see the strings, they stop pulling them. The wisdom that emerged wasn't about winning or dominating. It was about balance. I remembered my grandfather's words. Strength without kindness is tyranny. Kindness without strength is slavery. For decades, I had lived in the second half of that sentence, enslaved by my own compassion. Integration brought me into the first half. Now I carried both, and that balance felt like alignment with something ancient, something that had always been waiting in my bones. It made me notice the ridiculous side of social conditioning. 2, people often expect you to forgive and forget. But I realized forgiveness without memory is just self-deception. Forgetting doesn't heal. It only repeats. Integration meant I remembered vividly, But without bitterness, I didn't need to punish anyone. The memory itself was enough of a teacher. Perhaps the most surreal part was how others started reacting. Friends who once dismissed me as too sensitive now asked for my advice, my perspective. One even said, "You always see what I miss." It was both flattering and ironic, given how much I had once silenced myself to avoid being called intrusive. Now, the very gift I had been told to bury was the one they sought out. It was proof that integration wasn't about becoming someone new. It was about becoming who I had always been, unapologetically. Sometimes I wondered if this was what Jung felt when he wrote about individuation, that strange mix of terror and liberation when you realize you're no longer half a person, but whole. It's daunting to carry yourself fully, but it's also the only way to truly live. Application was where everything became startlingly real. Integration had given me the clarity, but application was the test. How to use it in a world that had grown accustomed to me being silent, pliant, endlessly forgiving. If integration was the unlocked chest, then application was me finally taking out the tools inside and learning which one fit each moment. It wasn't vengeance. It wasn't theater. It was deliberate, precise, and oddly peaceful. I remember one of the first times it showed up. A colleague tried to corner me into taking responsibility for a project delay that wasn't mine. The old me would have apologized reflexively, offered to stay late, bent myself into a pretzel to fix what I hadn't broken. Instead, I looked at him, steady and calm, and said, "That's not accurate. The delay was in your department, and I won't be taking responsibility for it." There was no heat in my tone, no quiver in my voice, just fact. His face flushed as though I had slapped him, but all I had done was state the truths. That was application. The simple act of not carrying someone else's weight. The shock on people's faces was always the same. They expected chaos or tears, maybe even rage. What they weren't prepared for was surgical precision. I used to think truth-telling meant confrontation, but application taught me it could be elegance. One sentence, calmly delivered, could dismantle an entire manipulation. I half joked once that I'd become a human lie detector, but really it was more like being an editor, crossing out the unnecessary, keeping only the essential. There's a quirky fact I stumbled upon during this time. Jellyfish have existed for over 500 million years, surviving multiple mass extinctions without a brain. When I read that, I laughed out loud. If jellyfish could survive without a brain, surely I could survive without carrying everyone else's baggage. Sometimes survival isn't about having the most force. It's about adapting in silence until the environment shifts. That, I realized, was the genius of application. Of course, applying this clarity wasn't always comfortable. Family dinners became landmines. Someone would slip into old patterns, guilt trips, subtle digs, emotional hooks. Instead of biting my tongue or internalizing the sting, I started responding differently. Once, when a relative said, "Well, you've always been the difficult one," I smiled and replied, "Or maybe I've just been the honest one." There was a stunned silence, the kind where forks hang midair. Then, for the first time in decades, the conversation shifted, not because I won, but because I refused to play. It was during this phase I started noticing what Jung had hinted at, the predator's instinct. Manipulative people seemed to sense, almost viscerally, that something about me had changed. They avoided me. Their usual tricks failed to land, like arrows bouncing off armor. At first, I wondered if I was imagining it, but the pattern repeated so consistently that I knew it wasn't chance. People who thrived on control gravitated elsewhere. Those who valued authenticity drew closer. Application wasn't just a personal shift, it was an environmental filter. I also began to appreciate the humor in everyday dynamics. One time, a friend tried to rope me into a last-minute favor that would have cost me an entire weekend. I simply said, "No, that doesn't work for me." She blinked, stunned, and then laughed. "I don't think you've ever said no to me before." I grinned and quipped, "Don't worry, I'm still in beta testing." That became an inside joke, but it also marked something serious. I was no longer afraid of being disliked. That fear had evaporated with integration. Application was the proof. Wisdom often comes disguised as simplicity. I once heard an elderly woman at a cafe tell her granddaughter, "If you don't teach people how to treat you, they'll guess, and they'll usually guess wrong." That line stuck with me because it captured exactly what application felt like. I was finally teaching people through action, how to treat me. No lectures, no drama, just consistent boundaries. Academically, this stage could be framed as behavioral actualization, the process of aligning inner transformation with external conduct. But labels aside, for me it was simply breathing differently in familiar rooms. The walls hadn't changed. I had, and that shift altered the physics of every interaction. One of the strangest consequences was how silence itself became powerful. I used to fear silence, rushing to fill it with apologies, explanations, reassurances. Now, silence became my ally. When someone tried to bait me into defensiveness, I let the silence hang. It unsettled them more than words ever could. Silence, I realized, was not emptiness, it was presence, and with that presence came unexpected peace. The more I applied this clarity, the less drained I felt. It was like fixing a leak I hadn't known existed. No more bleeding energy into other people's dysfunction. No more rehearsing conversations in my head to justify my feelings. Application wasn't just outward, it was inward conservation, a restoration of my own life force. I wish I could tell you this stage was smooth, that everyone respected the new me instantly. The truth, some people doubled down. They accused me of arrogance, coldness, even cruelty, but I understood now those words were not reflections of me. They were projections of their discomfort, and for the first time, I didn't bend under them. I thought of bamboo, flexible in the wind, but unbroken at the root. That was me, strong, yet still soft. The strangest thing about this new presence was how predators reacted. It was almost primal, the way they stiffened, their eyes darting as though they'd sensed a silent alarm. I didn't have to say much, my very stillness seemed to unsettle them. Before, I would have felt invisible in their company, shrinking in on myself to avoid becoming a target. Now, it was as if my presence had reversed polarity. They couldn't quite get comfortable around me. One particular moment comes to mind. A man I'd known for years, someone who thrived on controlling conversations with subtle jabs, leaned across a dinner table to deliver one of his trademark backhanded compliments. "You're finally speaking up. That's brave of you." The old me would have forced a smile, maybe even thanked him. Instead, I simply looked at him for a long second and replied, "No, it's not brave. It's overdue." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. But his reaction was extraordinary. He physically recoiled, as though the words had weight. This was the predator's unease. Jung called it an instinct, and I began to see what he meant. People who relied on manipulation seemed to recognize, instinctively, that their weapons no longer worked. It was like walking into a room with a magnet and finding that the old tricks didn't stick anymore. I wasn't combative. I wasn't cold, but I wasn't available for exploitation, and they could sense it before I even opened my mouth. A curious fact I stumbled upon during this period fascinated me. Scientists have discovered that certain birds can see ultraviolet light, revealing patterns invisible to the human eye. To me, this was the perfect metaphor for what had shifted. I hadn't grown new senses. I had simply stopped ignoring the patterns that were always there. The manipulation, the dishonesty, the undercurrents, they were as clear as ultraviolet markings. Others couldn't see them, but I could, and that vision changed everything. There's an old saying I often think about now. Wolves don't attack the lioness. They sense her bite. This resonated with me in a way that made me laugh a little bitterly at first. I wasn't a lioness before. I was a deer, docile, grazing, hoping the wolves would pass me by. But something in my energy had shifted. I hadn't become aggressive, I had become unyielding. And predators, for all their bravado, aren't as reckless as they appear. They don't waste time on prey that can fight back. Of course, this shift confused those who had known me for years. A friend once said to me, half joking, "You've changed. You feel sharp now." I smiled and replied, "Not sharp, just clear." She tilted her head, considering, and admitted, "It's unsettling, but in a good way." That became a kind of refrain. People didn't always have the words, but they felt the difference. Academically, some might describe this as boundary consolidation, the process by which one's personal thresholds become so firmly internalized that they need little external enforcement. But I thought of it more simply. It was like learning to walk upright after years of crawling. It wasn't a new ability. It was the natural next step. I also discovered humor was a powerful ally here. One evening, Someone tried to provoke me with a barbed remark. "You always think you're right. Don't you?" Instead of bristling, I chuckled and said, "No, I just stop pretending I'm wrong when I'm not." The table laughed. The tension dissolved, and the would-be manipulator sat back, defeated without a fight. Sometimes a well-placed joke can disarm more effectively than a wall of anger. What fascinated me most was the ripple effect of this unease. When predators backed off, others leaned in. People who had once been quiet around me began to open up, sensing that I was safe. Vulnerable stories poured out where manipulation had once thrived. It was as though my new presence acted like a filter, separating the authentic from the exploitative. There was wisdom in realizing this. Not everyone who leaves your side is a loss. In fact, sometimes their departure is the greatest gift. Age teaches you this slowly, but awakening teaches you it all at once. When someone cannot handle your clarity, it is not your burden. It is their exposure, and yet, the most striking part was how peaceful it felt. I had imagined that defending myself would require aggression, armor, and constant vigilance. Instead, it required stillness. I wasn't fighting anyone. I was simply no longer available for their games. The predator's unease was not because I had become violent, it was because I had become free. One final image lingers in my mind. I once walked into a room where someone who had previously exploited my silence was waiting. He glanced up, saw me, and his smile faltered. He shifted uncomfortably, looked away, and busied himself with something trivial. I hadn't said a word, but he knew. They all know. The peace that followed my awakening was unlike anything I had known before. It wasn't the hollow quiet that comes from numbing oneself, nor the forced serenity of pretending everything is fine. It was a grounded, steady calm, the kind you feel after a storm. When the air is clear and the debris has been washed away, for the first time, I wasn't waiting for someone else to give me permission to breathe. I gave that permission to myself. Jung described this moment as shadow integration, though at the time I didn't know the term. All I knew was that something within me had clicked into place. My compassion, which had once been limitless to the point of self-erasure, now had borders. My empathy was no longer a sponge soaking up every spill around me. It was a river with banks, flowing freely but contained, and that, to me, was freedom. A memory stands out vividly. I was in a cafe, sitting with a friend who had often drained me with her constant crises. In the past, I would have leaned in, taken notes in my mind, offered solutions, and left feeling wrung dry. But on that day, I simply listened. When she reached the point where she usually asked, "What do you think I should do?" I sipped my tea, smiled, and replied, "What do you think you should do?" She blinked, startled. For a moment I saw panic flicker in her eyes, as though I'd pulled away the safety net she'd always relied on. But then something unexpected happened. She thought, really thought, and in that pause, she found an answer on her own. That was the difference. My empathy had stopped enabling and started empowering. This was what Jung meant by psychological completion. Though I think of it as balance, I still cared deeply, but I no longer confused caring with caring. I could stand beside someone without climbing into their skin. I could love without losing myself in the process. That balance gave me strength I didn't know I had. There's a quirky fact I love to share whenever I think about balance. Did you know that flamingos can only stand on one leg for hours because of the way their tendons lock into place? They're not straining, they're resting. To me, that's what integration felt like. From the outside, it may have looked like effort, but inside it was the most natural, restful state. I wasn't contorting myself anymore. I was simply locking into my true form. Some scholars might argue that what I experienced was a form of individuation, the process Jung identified as the realization of the self. They would dissect it with academic precision, placing my experience into neat categories. Perhaps they'd be right, but living it felt far less clinical. It was messy, raw, frightening, and yet profoundly simple. It was the moment I realized I was whole, not in spite of my shadow, but because of it. What surprised me most was how quickly life began to rearrange itself around this inner shift. Toxic people drifted away, sometimes with dramatic exits, sometimes with quiet fade-outs. At first, I panicked. Who would remain if everyone who had taken advantage of me left? The answer, as it turned out, was beautiful. Only those who valued me for who I truly was. With time, I began to notice how others responded to this new balance. Authentic people seemed to lean into it, drawn by the safety of knowing where they stood with me. They knew I wouldn't pretend. I wouldn't flatter. I wouldn't sugarcoat truth to spare their illusions. And because of that, they trusted me more. One person even said, "I feel like I can breathe around you now." That, to me, was the highest compliment. It wasn't all effortless. Of course, there were days when old habits tugged at me, whispering that maybe I should stay silent to keep the peace, that maybe I should take on someone else's burden to avoid conflict. But each time, I remembered the price I had already paid for that silence. Wisdom grows with age, but it sharpens with awakening. I told myself, peace at the cost of self is not peace at all, it's submission. I also discovered the strange joy of humor in this phase. At a family gathering, a relative tried to guilt trip me with, "You never do enough for the family." The old me would have wilted, apologized, promised to do better. This time, I grinned and said, "You're right. I've been slacking on carrying everyone's emotional luggage. I'll send you the bill next time." The room erupted with laughter, and the guilt tripper had no ground left to stand on. Sometimes levity is sharper than a blade. Looking back, I see this stage as a kind of re-education. For years, I had been taught that love meant sacrifice, that boundaries were selfish, that sensitivity was weakness. Awakening taught me the opposite. Love thrives with boundaries. Generosity grows from balance. And sensitivity, when directed consciously, is power. It was as though I had been living upside down. And now everything was finally upright. The peace of this new state wasn't loud or triumphant. It was quiet, steady, and unshakable. I no longer felt the need to prove myself, to defend my worth, or to justify my boundaries. I simply lived them, and those who respected that stayed. Those who didn't left. Simple and liberating. What I learned, and what Jung captured in his own way, is that true integration doesn't make you harder. It makes you clearer. The storm inside settles, and what remains is a calm that cannot be faked or stolen. The kind of calm that unsettles predators and comforts the authentic. The kind of calm that feels, finally, like home. When the dust settled after that transformation, I noticed something unexpected. People reacted to me differently. It wasn't because I was louder or more forceful, quite the opposite. I had grown quieter, but the silence carried weight. Those who once exploited my gentleness seemed uneasy in my presence, as though they sensed a boundary they could no longer breach. I didn't need to announce this change. It radiated out, unmistakable, like a shift in air pressure before a storm. I remember one striking moment at work. A colleague who had long treated me like a convenient sounding board came into my office, ready with the usual dramatic monologue. But halfway through her story, she paused, looked at me, and faltered. "What's different about you?" she asked. I simply smiled and replied, "I've stopped apologizing for existing." She laughed nervously, but she didn't return the following week. That was the effect. Not aggression, but an energy so steady that those who thrived on chaos couldn't tolerate it. Jung referred to this phenomenon in his writings as the predator's instinct. Manipulative people sense when their games no longer work. They feel exposed, stripped of their usual tools, and instinctively retreat. I didn't have to confront anyone or raise my voice. The change was subtle but undeniable, like standing in sunlight after years in shadow. Predators don't thrive in light. There's an old piece of wisdom I came to appreciate deeply during this period. Sometimes the most powerful statement is your absence. When I withdrew from unhealthy dynamics, they collapsed on their own, without me to absorb the blame, patch the cracks, or smooth the edges. Dysfunction stood naked for all to see. At first, it pained me. Watching families fracture or friendships disintegrate felt like failure. But then I realized I hadn't caused the collapse. I had simply stopped propping up the scaffolding of lies. Truth had done the rest. And here's a quirky fact to lighten the mood. Did you know sunflowers can sense each other and actually turn to face one another when the sun is hidden? They call it heliotropism. It struck me as oddly poetic. People do the same. We lean towards those who shine with authenticity when the world feels dim. My integration gave me that quality. Those seeking truth leaned in. Those seeking shadows turned away. Academically, some would frame this as a process of individuation, the crystallization of the self into a form that others recognize and respect. Others might call it a boundary shift in social psychology, but from my lived perspective, it felt more primal than theory could capture. It was survival. It was instinct. It was the moment when my nervous system stopped vibrating like a tuning fork for other people's chaos and settled into its own rhythm. I began to notice that this calm, integrated presence didn't just repel manipulators, it attracted genuine people. Conversations grew richer, relationships more balanced. Even small interactions in shops or on the street carried a sense of respect. A cashier once told me, "You look like someone who knows what they want." It was such a small comment, but I carried it home like a treasure. Because for years, I hadn't known. Now I did. One of the more humorous episodes came when an old acquaintance tried to reinsert themselves into my life, full of the same melodrama that had once pulled me in. They sat across from me, sighing, waiting for me to offer the sympathy buffet I used to serve so generously. Instead, I leaned back, stirred my coffee, and said, "Sounds like you've got a lot on your plate. Maybe you should try smaller bites." The look on their face was priceless. They never came back for seconds. Sometimes humor is the most polite form of eviction. I also began to trust something I had spent years doubting. My perceptions. I no longer needed someone else to confirm whether my feelings were valid or my observations accurate. I trusted myself completely. That trust was intoxicating. It made decision-making effortless, relationships smoother, and work projects successful. When someone tried to gaslight me, I didn't argue, I simply smiled, walked away, and let them drown in their own contradictions. Silence became my sword. The interesting thing was how people around me adjusted. Those who were healthy began to flourish. My steadiness gave them space to grow. My refusal to enable forced them to find their own strength. But those who thrived on manipulation grew restless. They poked and prodded, looking for cracks. When they found none, they vanished. My life simplified itself without me lifting a finger. In this stage, I understood what Jung had hinted at but never fully declared. Integration doesn't make you invincible in the sense of being untouchable. It makes you untouchable in the sense that no one can distort your reality anymore. You see through games instantly. You notice the twitch in someone's face when they lie, the hesitation in their voice when they conceal, the slip in their tone when they manipulate. And once seen, those games lose all their power. It was around this time that I coined my own phrase, "I see you, but I don't need you." It became my mantra. I whispered it when an old memory surfaced, when a manipulator circled back, when my own insecurities tried to creep in. "I see you, but I don't need you." That was liberation in its purest form. Looking back, I think this was the part that scared people most. Not that I had become cruel or hardened, but that I no longer required their approval, their validation, or their permission. I could walk away from any table, any room, any relationship, without begging to be invited back. That unnerved those who once had power over me, and it empowered me beyond measure. This new way of being was not loud. It was not flashy. It was calm, still, steady, like the center of a storm, unmoved while everything else whirled around it. I didn't need to fight to prove my strength. My peace was proof enough. As life moved forward with this newfound equilibrium, I noticed something remarkable. Success seemed to flow more naturally than ever before. It wasn't that I suddenly acquired new skills or resources, rather, I had stopped leaking energy into places that never deserved it. With my focus sharpened and my self-trust intact, decisions became easier, opportunities clearer, and progress almost inevitable. Jung himself had written that once empaths integrate their shadow, they become selectively empathetic. That phrase resonated with me deeply. I still cared intensely, but now I directed that care with intention, like water finding the right channels instead of flooding everywhere at once. My career, once a slow trudge through mud, began to accelerate. Projects I had procrastinated on for years suddenly seemed achievable. I had the clarity to identify which collaborations would nourish me and which would drain me. It was as though my intuition had finally been given permission to sit in the driver's seat. And you know what? It steered better than my rational mind ever did. Clients commented on my ability to anticipate their needs before they even voiced them. Friends marveled at my knack for reading the atmosphere in a room within seconds. These weren't supernatural powers. They were simply the gifts I had always possessed, now sharpened by integration. But here's the unsettling part. The same ability that made me thrive also gave me the capacity to manipulate. I could see people's insecurities so clearly. I knew exactly which words would unravel them, which silences would unnerve them. It was terrifying to realize how easily I could weaponize empathy. This was Jung's great fear, too. The possibility that awakened empaths might turn their precision into cruelty. Yet, here's where wisdom comes in. Just because you hold the sword doesn't mean you must swing it. I realized that real power isn't about domination, it's about restraint. There's a proverb I once heard from an elderly neighbor who had lived through more wars than I could count. The sharpest blade is the one left in its sheath. It stuck with me. Power without restraint is chaos, but power with restraint becomes mastery. I found joy not in exposing people's weaknesses, but in protecting my peace. If someone tried to bait me, I no longer rose to it. I didn't need to win arguments or prove my insight. Instead, I simply withdrew my attention, and that was often the most devastating blow of all. Here's a quirky fact that pairs perfectly with this realization. Octopuses have been observed escaping their aquariums at night, slithering into other tanks to steal food, and then returning without leaving a trace. They don't need to attack openly. Their genius lies in subtlety. That's how I felt, except instead of sneaking into tanks, I was quietly reclaiming the energy I had wasted. My victories weren't loud, they were efficient. On an academic note, some scholars debate whether empathy should be categorized as an evolutionary advantage or a maladaptive trait in modern society. I can't help but smile at that debate, because once integrated, empathy is unquestionably an advantage. It allows for quicker adaptation, better cooperation, and sharper discernment. The problem isn't empathy itself, it's empathy without boundaries. Without integration, empathy becomes exploitation waiting to happen. With integration, it becomes a compass too accurate to ignore. One particular incident brought this into sharp relief. An old antagonist from my past resurfaced, trying the same tricks they had once used so effectively. They dangled guilt, played the victim, and peppered conversations with subtle barbs. But instead of falling into their trap, I simply tilted my head, listened with genuine curiosity, and then said, "You know, it's fascinating how consistent you are. Same script, different year?" The silence that followed was deafening. They knew I saw them completely, and in that moment, the game ended without a fight. The transformation was evident in my relationships, too. My circle grew smaller but infinitely more authentic. I no longer tolerated half-truths or manipulations disguised as love. Instead, I sought out people who valued honesty, reciprocity, and growth. Conversations became less about complaining and more about creating. Even disagreements felt different, less about tearing each other down, more about refining perspectives. The absence of toxicity left room for nourishment. I also began experimenting with silence as a deliberate tool. If someone asked me a manipulative question designed to corner me, I didn't answer. I simply let the silence hang in the air until they became uncomfortable. Silence, I learned, is often louder than words. It unsettles manipulators because they rely on your reactions to fuel their tactics. Without reaction, they have nothing. This phase of my journey brought me a kind of serenity I had never imagined possible. I stopped rushing, stopped apologizing, stopped negotiating with my own worth. Life became less about proving and more about being. My days felt lighter, my nights calmer, my interactions simpler. It wasn't that challenges disappeared, it was that I finally trusted myself to navigate them. And humor, of course, followed me everywhere. Once, in the middle of a tense meeting, someone tried to corner me with a question dripping in passive aggression. I looked at them and said, "That's a great question. I'll be sure to ask it when I find someone qualified to answer." The room erupted in laughter, and the tension evaporated instantly. It reminded me that power doesn't always have to be heavy. Sometimes it's featherlight and disarming. In this period, I realized that awakening isn't about becoming untouchable. It's about becoming unshakable. The storms didn't stop coming, but they no longer knocked me over. I had roots now, deep and steady. I could sway. I could bend, but I wouldn't break. And in that steadiness, I found a kind of freedom I had never known before. There comes a point in this transformation where people begin to treat you differently. Even if you haven't announced a single change, it's as though your energy shifts, and everyone around you senses it without quite knowing why. Friends who once unloaded their problems onto me without hesitation started hesitating, almost testing the waters before launching into another monologue. Colleagues who had spoken over me in meetings suddenly paused, waiting to see if I had something to say. Even family members, who had long relied on me as the eternal peacekeeper, became noticeably more cautious. It wasn't because I had grown colder or crueler. It was because I had stopped being an easy target. This phenomenon reminded me of something Jung called the predator's instinct. Manipulators can smell weakness, but they can also smell when it's gone. Like a wolf sniffing the air and deciding not to approach the fire. They sense when their usual tactics won't work anymore. And it's not just manipulators. Everyone, even the well-meaning, subconsciously adjusts their behavior when someone's boundaries shift. I noticed the atmosphere in rooms changing just because I walked in. Not because I demanded attention, but because I no longer leaked it. It reminded me of an old man I once met on a train. He told me, "Son, when you carry yourself like a mountain, even the wind respects your shape." I didn't understand it at the time. But now I see how posture, internal posture, not physical, dictates how the world moves around you. When you're unsteady, the world pushes harder. When you're grounded, the world bends to flow around you. Here's a quirky fact. Scientists have observed that trees release chemical signals through their roots to warn nearby trees of potential threats like pests. Those surrounding trees respond by producing natural repellents before the danger even arrives. In other words, resilience has a ripple effect. I realized the same thing was happening in my life. By becoming more integrated, I was unconsciously signaling to others how to behave around me. The people who could adapt thrived in my presence. The ones who couldn't fell away naturally. Academically, this invites a debate that psychologists still wrestle with. Is charisma innate, or is it simply the byproduct of internal alignment? I lean towards the latter. When you're aligned with your own truth, people notice, even if they can't articulate why. It isn't about flashy words or dominating energy, it's about coherence. People trust those who are consistent, because consistency feels safe. Of course, not everyone celebrated my transformation. Some found it unnerving. I remember one acquaintance snapping at me, "You've changed. You're not as easygoing as you used to be." They meant it as a criticism, but I couldn't help but smile. Easygoing had really meant easy to manipulate. And if being harder to exploit made me difficult, then so be it. I'll admit, it was sometimes lonely. Transformation doesn't just change you, it changes the ecosystem around you. Old dynamics collapse. Familiar patterns disintegrate. Some people drift away, not because they dislike you, but because they no longer recognize themselves in your reflection. Empaths, by nature, are mirrors. And when your reflection sharpens, it forces others to see their own distortions more clearly. Not everyone is ready for that. But here's the wisdom that comes with age. It's better to be alone with peace than surrounded by chaos. I've seen elderly couples who stayed together out of habit, simmering in silent resentment. And I've seen solitary elders radiating calm because they chose integrity over convenience. When you're young, you think quantity of connection matters. When you've lived long enough, you realize quality is all that ever did. One evening, at a gathering, I overheard someone whisper, "Don't mess with them, they see straight through you." At first, I felt a pang of isolation, as though I'd become untouchable. But then I realized it wasn't fear they were voicing, it was respect. Respect feels strange when you're used to being underestimated. It's like wearing shoes that are finally the right size after years of pinching or slipping. At first, it feels uncomfortable. Then you wonder how you ever lived otherwise. Humor followed me here, too. Once, someone tried to guilt me into attending an event I didn't want to go to. They piled on phrases like, "You'd make me so happy if you came." I replied with a smile, "Well, if my happiness isn't included in the price, I'll have to pass." The look on their face was priceless. Light jokes, I found, were often the best shields. They disarm manipulative tactics without escalating tension. This stage of the journey was less about building walls and more about radiating signals. People who were meant to stay leaned in closer, curious and comfortable. People who weren't meant to stay found reasons to walk away. And I didn't chase anymore. That was the biggest shift of all. I stopped trying to convince anyone of my worth, my loyalty, my intentions. I simply let my presence speak. There's something liberating about no longer needing to defend yourself. Silence becomes a friend. Solitude becomes a sanctuary, and peace becomes the natural default. That doesn't mean life is free from conflict. It means conflict no longer consumes you. And in that space, I noticed something extraordinary. Just as trees warn other trees, my transformation had ripple effects on the people around me. A close friend who had always been a doormat in their relationships began setting boundaries. A sibling who had spent years drowning in guilt started speaking their mind. My calmness gave them permission to trust their own voices, and it dawned on me that the empath's greatest gift isn't absorbing others' pain. It's modeling how to transmute it. When I think back on those early transformations, what strikes me most is how permanent they were. I had assumed, like most people do, that change would be a pendulum swinging back and forth, moments of strength followed by relapses into old habits. But once I crossed that threshold, there was no return to the old me. It was as though a door had been shut and locked behind me, with no key in sight. And the strange thing was, I didn't even want to go back. In the beginning, this permanence startled me. I kept waiting for the familiar tug of guilt to pull me back into apologizing for boundaries or softening my words to spare others. But the guilt never came. Instead, there was a deep, almost unsettling calm. It was like standing at the edge of a storm you once lived in and realizing you were no longer wet. You could still see the lightning, still hear the thunder, but none of it touched you anymore. That calmness was my most powerful weapon. People expected me to explode, to rage, to deliver fiery speeches about my pain. Instead, I simply spoke truth, as if reading aloud from a record that had always existed. Facts, patterns, choices, not accusations, just clarity. Jung once described this as the moment an individual integrates their shadow, when the parts of themselves that were once silenced are invited back into the whole. For me, that meant reclaiming my intuition, my intelligence, and my right to enforce limits. Here's the quirky fact I stumbled upon while reading one evening. Octopuses, those strange and brilliant sea creatures, have the ability to regenerate lost limbs, but they don't just grow them back casually, they regrow them perfectly, nerve endings and all, as though nothing had ever been missing. I couldn't help but see the metaphor. Empaths, too, can regenerate when pieces of us are cut away by years of neglect or manipulation. They can return, stronger and more precise than before. The body remembers wholeness, and so does the psyche. This is where the academic debate creeps in. Is resilience something learned through hardship, or is it an innate capacity that simply lies dormant until tested? My own life makes me believe it's a mixture of both. Hardship may trigger the process, but the potential for resilience must already exist within us, waiting to be called forth. Not everyone transforms in the face of betrayal, but those who do reveal a strength that seems almost preordained. One evening, during this stage of my awakening, I visited an old friend who had known me during my most fragile years. We sat across from each other, and I could see the way their eyes searched mine, looking for the cracks that used to be there. After a long silence, they said, "You don't flinch anymore." I hadn't realized it, but they were right. For years, I had flinched at raised voices, harsh words, even sudden movements. Now, nothing shook me. That absence of flinching wasn't arrogance. It was the embodied knowledge that I could withstand storms without being destroyed. It reminded me of something my grandmother used to say. In her gently wrinkled wisdom, when you plant a tree, don't protect it from every gust of wind. Let it bend a little, or it will snap when the storm comes. She was right. My bending years had given me strength, but the snapping, that final betrayal, had taught me permanence. I had bent until I broke, and breaking had turned into blooming. Humor made its way into these days as well. I recall once when someone tried to manipulate me with the line, "After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me." Without missing a beat, I replied, "Yes, with peace and distance. It's the best repayment plan on the market." I chuckled to myself afterward, amazed at how much lighter conflict felt when you treated it less like a battlefield and more like a comedy show with bad actors. The greatest gift of this permanence was clarity. Decisions that had once paralyzed me became effortless. Should I stay or leave? Should I speak or remain silent? Should I forgive or walk away? The answers weren't carved in stone, but they rose up from within like water from a spring. For the first time in my life, I trusted those answers without second guessing, and that trust reshaped everything. Relationships changed overnight. I left situations that had drained me for years. I entered new ones with people who met me with honesty and mutual respect. I found myself excelling at work, not because I was suddenly more skilled, but because I no longer wasted energy doubting myself. The shift was so visible that even acquaintances remarked on it. One said, "It's like you've switched from analog to HD." I laughed, but I knew what they meant. My presence had gone from blurry to sharp, from muted to vivid. This sharpened presence frightened manipulators. They kept their distance, offering polite but hollow smiles, as if testing whether I would notice their insincerity. And I did, every time. But instead of confronting or correcting them, I simply let them drift away. That was the difference. My goal was no longer to change anyone. It was simply to remain unchanged myself. Looking back, I realized that this permanence is what Jung meant by psychological completion. Once you integrate, you cannot unsee your own worth. You can't pretend you don't notice the patterns. You can't go back to silencing yourself without feeling the dissonance clawing at your insides. It's not just a transformation, it's a point of no return. And so, permanence became my quiet companion. It wasn't loud or flashy. It didn't announce itself, but it stood with me, solid and unyielding, reminding me that once an empath awakens, they cannot fall back asleep. The world may still be chaotic, but inside, the ground remains steady. In those years after my awakening, what fascinated me most was not just how I changed, but how the world around me reacted. It was as though my transformation sent out invisible ripples that disturbed every pond I stepped into. People I had known for years suddenly didn't seem to know how to behave around me. Some drew closer, as if sensing safety they had been searching for, while others backed away, uneasy with the fact that their old tricks no longer worked. It reminded me of walking into a room and switching on a bright light. Those with nothing to hide welcomed the illumination, smiling at the clarity. Those with secrets squinted, uncomfortable with how much was suddenly visible. I didn't have to accuse anyone, or even speak about their behavior. My very presence reflected back what they had been hiding, and the reflection unsettled them. I came to call this the empath's mirror effect. The strangest part was how quickly the dynamics shifted. Relatives who had relied on me for endless emotional labor grew quieter. Friends who had once vented endlessly without reciprocating suddenly limited their calls. At first, I feared I had become cold or unkind, but then I realized the truth. They weren't receiving the unearned comfort they had grown used to. I had stopped being the shock absorber for everyone else's dysfunction, and so the dysfunction was left exposed in the open. This is where a quirky fact slipped into my mind. I read somewhere that when you remove a sponge from an ecosystem, the balance changes drastically because sponges filter and absorb massive amounts of waste in the water. Remove them, and suddenly everything floating around becomes much more visible. That's exactly what happened when I stopped absorbing everyone's emotional waste. The ecosystem of my relationships changed overnight. Jung understood this too, though he described it in more clinical terms. He called it the withdrawal of the projection surface. In plain language, people had been using me as a screen onto which they projected their anger, fear, and insecurity. Once I stopped playing that role, they had to confront those projections within themselves. That confrontation was uncomfortable, and some chose distance over facing it. What I learned from all this was profound. You don't have to fight dysfunction. You just have to stop feeding it. Once you stop participating, it either collapses or finds another host. And though it may sound harsh, that withdrawal is the most loving thing you can do, not just for yourself, but for everyone involved. Without enablers, unhealthy patterns are forced into the light. An elderly neighbor of mine put it beautifully over tea one afternoon. She said, "You can't keep sweeping dirt under the rug forever. At some point, the rug itself starts to look lumpy." Her wrinkled hands gestured as if smoothing an imaginary carpet, and I laughed, but her wisdom sank deep. That's exactly what I had done for years, smoothed out the lumps, pretending nothing was wrong. Once I stopped, the dirt became impossible to ignore. I remember the first time I visited family after my awakening. I sat quietly as conversations unfolded, noticing the usual patterns of complaint and criticism, but instead of offering solutions or sympathy, I simply listened. At one point, a cousin asked why I wasn't saying anything. I smiled softly and replied, "Because it's not mine to fix." The room fell silent. It wasn't anger, just a quiet refusal to play my old role. That one sentence shifted years of dynamics more than any argument ever could. Humor continued to play its part. Someone once tried to guilt trip me by saying, "If you loved me, you'd do this for me." I grinned and said, "If I loved you anymore, I'd start charging rent for all the space you take up in my head." The look on their face was priceless, equal parts confusion and reluctant laughter. That was the beauty of humor. It disarmed manipulation without malice. Academically, this stage raised the debate about systemic change versus individual change. Do individuals like me actually alter family and social systems? Or do we just remove ourselves, forcing the system to adapt on its own? I've come to believe it's both. By shifting myself, I inevitably altered the system. Even if my intent wasn't to change others, the system either adjusted or fractured, but in both cases, it revealed its true form. As the mirror effect intensified, I became more selective about where I placed my energy, not because I cared less, but because I cared more wisely. I realized that empathy without boundaries is like pouring water into a leaking bucket. The water disappears, the bucket never fills, and you're left exhausted. But empathy with boundaries? That's like pouring water into fertile soil. It nourishes growth, not dysfunction. The result was an entirely new circle of people around me. Those who stayed were authentic, willing to face themselves, willing to grow. Conversations became richer, lighter, more genuine. There was laughter. There was mutual care. There was respect. I realized that healthy relationships don't drain, they sustain. For the first time, I wasn't giving until empty. I was giving and receiving in balance. I recall one evening walking home after dinner with friends who uplifted me. The night air was crisp, and I could hear the hum of the city around me. For the first time in years, I felt a simple but profound truth. I belonged, not because I was useful, not because I absorbed pain, but because I was me. And that belonging wasn't tied to any one person. It was anchored within myself. The empath's mirror effect had done its work. By standing in my truth, by refusing to carry what wasn't mine, I had created space for genuine connection. It wasn't about cutting people out of my life as much as it was about cutting false roles out of myself. What remained was clarity. And with clarity came peace. With clarity came not just peace, but purpose. And I began to see that my awakening wasn't an endpoint at all, but a doorway into something larger. The years of absorbing, breaking, and then integrating had transformed me into someone I hardly recognized, and yet, for the first time, I felt I was entirely myself. I often thought back to Jung's words about the integrated self, the wholeness that comes not from denying the shadow, but from weaving it into the fabric of who you are. That wholeness was what I now carried with me each day, and it changed the way I moved through the world. Life after awakening was quieter in some ways and louder in others. Quieter, because the endless noise of self-doubt had finally gone silent. Louder, because my perception of truth was now impossible to ignore. I didn't just hear people's words, I heard the tremor beneath them, the unspoken history, the unacknowledged fears, and instead of feeling burdened by it, I felt steady, even curious. It was as if I had developed new eyes, and with them came the responsibility of how to use what I saw. This is where wisdom of age echoed again. An older mentor once told me, "The real measure of power is how gently you use it." That stayed with me, especially in moments where I could have exposed someone's hypocrisy or cut them down with surgical words. I had the ability, but I also had the choice. And over again, I chose restraint, not silence from fear, but silence from strength, because I realized that not every truth needed to be spoken aloud. Sometimes it was enough just to know it. The oddest realization during this time was how success seemed to arrive naturally. Projects I had once overthought began to flow. Opportunities appeared as if drawn by a magnet. I understood why, when you are no longer at war with yourself. Your energy becomes focused, clear, impossible to ignore. I became what Jung might have called selectively empathetic, pouring my care into the right places, investing it like a seasoned gardener tending to fertile soil instead of wasting seed on barren ground. One quirky fact amused me endlessly during this stage. Did you know octopuses have 3 hearts? And 2 of them stop beating when they swim. I felt oddly like that once. I had kept all my hearts working overtime, desperately pumping empathy into every situation. Now, I allowed some of those hearts to rest, focusing their beat only where it truly mattered, It wasn't less love. It was love that finally understood its own worth. And yet, with all this, I couldn't escape one haunting thought. If more empaths were to awaken, what would society look like? Academics often debate the concept of collective transformation, whether enough individuals healing themselves can alter the trajectory of entire communities. From my vantage point, I believe it can. Each awakened empath becomes a node of clarity, a stabilizing force that others unconsciously recognize. Manipulators instinctively avoid them, while those seeking authenticity gravitate towards them. Multiply that by thousands. And perhaps we see the beginnings of cultural evolution. I remember sitting by the window one rainy evening, watching the water trail down the glass, and I thought, this is what awakening feels like. Not a firestorm, not a battle, but a cleansing rain that washes away the dust so the world is clearer. And clarity, once seen, cannot be unseen. Humor still had its place, of course. One friend teased me about my transformation, saying, "So, you've gone from emotional doormat to emotional Jedi." I laughed and replied, "Well, at least now I'm choosing my lightsaber instead of handing it over to anyone who asks." It was a silly joke, but it captured the essence of it. My empathy had become a conscious weapon, not a liability. The mirror effect had shifted into something even deeper by now. I no longer mirrored dysfunction alone. I reflected possibility. People left my company not just unsettled, but sometimes inspired, realizing that they too could stop apologizing for who they were. That was the quiet gift I hadn't expected. By embodying my truth, I gave silent permission for others to discover theirs. In the end, the journey wasn't about power at all. It was about balance. Balance between caring and protecting, between feeling and discerning, between speaking and remaining silent. It was the balance Jung had hinted at when he spoke of individuation, the sacred task of becoming whole. And in that balance, I found freedom. So where does it all leave me now? Not as a saint, not as a cynic, but as something in between, a human who has walked through fire, absorbed the smoke, and emerged carrying both scars and wisdom. The empath's path, I realized, was never about escaping pain. It was about learning to transform it, to let it shape us into beings who could carry both love and boundaries with equal grace. And perhaps that's the final reflection worth sharing tonight. Life is not about avoiding shadows, but learning to dance with them, to let them teach us the steps we never thought we could master. I've learned that the most terrifying transformation in human nature is not something to fear, but something to embrace. Because when the empath awakens, they don't lose themselves, they finally come home to themselves. And so, we come to the close of this long, winding path together, a journey that has carried us through silence, through shadows, through the difficult beauty of transformation. If you've stayed with me this far, let your body soften a little. Let the muscles around your eyes release, and just allow the words to settle like gentle mist across your evening. I want you to feel the rhythm slowing, the edges of thought rounding off, so that all that remains is a sense of calm steadiness. The story we've traced isn't really about Jung, or even about empaths alone. It is about the universal truth that every fragile soul carries a core of resilience, and that tenderness, once it finds its boundaries, becomes one of the strongest forces in the world. It is about remembering that the things we hide, the parts we fear, are often the missing pieces that make us whole. And it is about recognizing that awakening doesn't mean hardening or losing love, but rather learning to direct it wisely. So let yourself breathe deeply now. Imagine that you, too, have walked through the rain and come out clearer on the other side, with vision that no longer doubts itself. The noise of other people's demands, the weight of old expectations, can slip away here. What remains is simple: the knowledge that your sensitivity is not weakness, but the quiet engine of your strength. I will leave you with this thought. Life asks us not to erase who we are, but to integrate every piece until we stand complete. The empath's path shows us that love is strongest when paired with clarity, and clarity is kindest when paired with love. Hold that balance gently, as though you are carrying a lantern through a darkened room. Let it guide you forward with confidence, not force, and allow the light to be as soft or as bright as you need it to be. So now, let the words fade. Let the night gather around you, and rest in the comfort of knowing you are enough exactly as you are. Good night, sleep deeply, and wake with the quiet certainty that your story, too, is unfolding exactly as it should.